Those of you who are veterans here have already heard this introduction many times, but this is the last of our series. We've been doing a series of morning's reflection using this book, Broken Gods, Hope, Healing, and the Seven Longings of the Human Heart. Those of you who have heard me, you can just tune out for the next couple minutes because it's always the same. The gist of the book, as I always say, it is written by a very good Catholic psychologist. It's not a quote-unquote spiritual book. It's taking a look at the seven virtues and vices from a psychologist, a Catholic psychologist's perspective, and he adds what I think are some very good insights. Now, I approach things somewhat differently as a priest, and I tend to approach them more, you would say, theologically. I think there's some good stuff in there. You take it or leave it, but it's been the base for our reflections. And kind of the genius behind the book is the following, and you've got your little printed up graph here, so you can see what I'm referring to. He says, behind the 7 deadly sins and the 7 corresponding virtues is always one of the 7 fundamental longings of the human heart. So what's happening is whenever you and I are tempted to, or when we actually fall into committing any of the 7 deadly sins, and frankly every sin ultimately falls one way or another into one of those 7 categories, what we're doing really is we are taking a mistaken path towards trying to fulfill one of the fundamental longings of the human heart. And there's this little graph here. We're already on the very last one. So we see the longing for abundance corresponding to the sin of pride, longing for dignity, envy, etc., etc., etc. Now this particular month, probably looks like on the surface one that's like, do we even really want to go here? Okay. And in all fairness, even I, when I was looking at it, was looking at it saying, okay, the longing for communion and the deadly sin of lust and the virtue of chastity, how do I apply that to the group of women I'm going to be preaching to? Really? Because, in all honesty, in order to understand these, I think we need to avoid just simple characterizations. For example, the vice of lust is more than just simply the most, animal instinct. There's more to it than that. And the virtue of chastity that goes much deeper than simply, continence and avoiding animal instinct, impulsive kind of sexual behavior. But what I would really like to focus on this retreat is that fundamental longing that we all have in our heart for communion. And I would say, I'm going to be going a little bit off script as regards the book, just basically taking the model. And this is just something that is coming more from my own just thoughts and prayers approaching things this week. I think out of all the longings of the human heart that are mentioned here, probably communion, the longing for, if you want, intimacy, communion with a person is probably, we could say, is the deepest. Each one of them can claim that right. But ultimately, the longing for communion goes down to the very core of why did God make us? We are made for love. We are made to love and to be loved. We are made by an all-loving God who is infinitely powerful, infinitely loving, infinitely knowledgeable, and who did not need us in order to be happy. The creation of the universe and all the angels and the saints and everything does not add one drop of happiness to God. So it's not like he, in a certain sense, gains anything out of making us, because he is already total and perfect fulfillment and happiness in and of himself. So why would God bother to do all the stuff he did in order to create the universe and all the angels and the saints and and spiritual beings and the whole 9 yards? Because God realized it's great being infinitely, totally happy in and of myself, but would it not be even more beautiful to have somebody to share happiness with? And therefore, As a total act of gratuitous generosity, God chose to create us. The reason you and I exist is so God can have somebody to share happiness with, to share love with, to enter into a relationship of love where, in a certain sense, the only thing he gets out of it is the pleasure, if you want, of seeing us become more and more like himself for our own sake, for our own benefit. So God's love is absolutely, totally generous and gratuitous. When we talk about, the desire for communion, I want to just give a couple of examples. How many of us, when you prepared for marriage, heard or said, or something along the lines of, "This is going to be the happiest day of your life"? You fools. No, sorry. No, there's a reason. There's a reason. Because matrimony speaks to the deepest longings of our heart, the deepest core of what we're made for. When we get married to another person, a human being made in God's image and likeness, and we consecrate ourselves to that person, we stop in a certain, properly understood, we stop striving to be a saint as individuals, and now properly understood, we are going to approach the vocation to holiness as a couple. Properly understood. Now, granted, in society, very frequently, it's anything but that, Frequently, what we witness is a characterization of romance, of marriage, of all that. When you see people more worried about the pageantry, about the dress and the flowers and hopefully the church, and if not the church, then the beach or whatever, the beautiful backdrop and the party afterward and all that stuff. When you see people getting more wrapped up in that aspect than they do in, for example, the marriage prep, which, by the way, is 99.9% of the people that we deal with. So even the good Catholics out there, it's like, okay, can we please get through the marriage prep as quickly as possible? Maximum, I want to spend like one day doing this. And you're like, this is the entire rest of your life. And we spend months getting ready for all the other, the details of the wedding. And you feel like you're getting your arm twisted if you have to make time to spend a day, God forbid a weekend, getting ready for the marriage. But when we talk about the happiest day of our life, there's something very true and very beautiful there. In the sense that for the first time, I am going to radically open myself up, in a certain sense, make myself vulnerable to, and open myself to a relationship of total reciprocal giving and receiving, and valuing a person absolutely out of love. And properly understood, this becomes a covenant that unites us more strongly to God and helps us to enter in more deeply into an understanding of what is God's love. At the deepest level, it's an image of what God wants to be in the soul of each baptized Catholic. By baptism, you are getting married. You never thought of that, did you? By baptism, in a real sense, you're getting married. The words, to me, the best definition of marriage comes from the book of Genesis, and Jesus himself quotes it later in the Gospel of Matthew, but he says, it's summarized in the words, the two become one. 4 words, the two become one. Yeah, I can count that high. 4 words, okay? That is the summary of marriage. What happens when you are baptized? Okay? There is a human being with a human soul, an independent human life. If you're a little child, probably there's not a whole lot of intellectual fireworks going on there, but there is a beautiful, pure little soul there. And there is God. And God chooses to unite himself with that human person through grace. There's a baptismal seal. It's like the wedding ring in a certain sense. But through sanctifying grace, God chooses to live in a human soul. And in a very real sense, the two become one. And we become, when we correspond to God's grace, what happens? We start to become holy. And when you become holy, you start to become God-like. Which is why when you look at the lives of saints, you look at the lives of really holy people out there, you realize they're different than everyone else. And it's not like they're worse. There's something more beautiful, more noble, more, I wish I had what they have, able about them than what you and I encounter when we look in the mirror. What's happened? Because they have taken seriously their relationship of intimacy with God, of communion with God, they have been transformed and they become more and more God-like. To the point where, like, when you look at John Paul II, and frankly, like Pope Francis recently made this video with all these young adults. I don't know if any of you watch it. As usual, it was somewhat controversial. I thought it was quite good. He pretty much met up with, I think it was 10 young adults between the ages like 19 and 26, I think it was. And they were seemingly, with one exception, they seemingly were all hand-picked practically to be representatives of people that just were not really particularly living their faith, or had walked away from the church and were living all these alternative lifestyles. And he just sat there and listened to them and took their questions and more or less gave answers. The reason I think people found that it was like sometimes less than satisfactory is he's putting himself in a forum where there's only so much you can say, unless you just stop people and run them over and everything. He was very respectfully listening, and then occasionally he would interject. So it was kind of a forum that didn't allow for like deep answers. But it's a very beautiful moment. And you look at the way people looked at him, they said, I saw Christ in the Pope. When I saw him listening and respecting each one of these people, even though some of them were just living bizarre situations, you see Christ in the man. John Paul II, I remember his last years, especially when I was living in Rome. The weaker he got, the more it looked like Christ was irradiating out of him. There was just a glow about him. And that's true of the saints. So anyway, boy, I'm getting off track in a hurry. So, I'm going to skip a couple of things. So what is it then that is the key to this longing for communion? I mean, we see here true means chastity, but that's not, frankly, where I'm going to go. The key to communion, I would say, is summarized in the word intimacy. Okay? Now, intimacy, again, understood properly, it's one of those words that gets characterized. Intimacy doesn't only mean sexual or physical intimacy, that's a dimension of it. Intimacy ultimately means that I reveal myself to you and you reveal yourself to me. And in the context of trust, and therefore of making myself vulnerable mutually, we, in a sense, expose ourselves because we trust, and there is a joy that comes from simply being accepted. Okay? Physically, also, that's why sexuality, why do you not just go around exposing yourself regularly? Well, it's because it is proper to a context of intimacy, where people have already made a commitment that I am going to give my life to you. This is not just another contact sport. I'm going to give my life to you. And therefore, and that's because I'm made of body and soul, that's going to involve both a physical as well as a spiritual and whatever other dimensions. And again, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself right now. Now, in my own reflection, I came up with, so I wish I could say, I'm backing on some great theological doctor or psychologist or something. I'm not. I'm banking on the deep, lifelong experience of Father Eric Nielsen, priest and Legionary of Christ. But I came up with basically 4 different degrees of communion, okay? And these 4 different degrees, as usual, they're not isolated silos. They overlap, they kind of spill into each other. they're all connected. However, I think there's also, like any of the virtues, for example, you can separate them, you can see them distinctly, even though they tend to blend into each other. The first one I'm going to call, I think you have it on your sheet, right? Companionship. Okay. So what are we talking about with companionship? Companionship basically comes down to, do you enjoy being around a person? I'll give you an example. Just actually about a week ago, when I was kind of kicking around ideas for the talk, and I was still wondering where did I really want to go with this. It's like, how much do I really want to preach about lust and chastity to a bunch of women? But about a week ago, this commercial break, you're in this beautiful house and everything. The priest here, one of our ongoing conversations is we're kicking around the idea eventually maybe of saying, can we turn this into like a full-time center, or at least a part-time center, and kind of expand its use and whatever. So I was talking to a couple of the guys that I and some of you know, Sam Skibo and Chris Gallion, because they both happen to be engaged, more or less construction kind of stuff. I was just getting their expertise. And just having the two guys over, just being themselves, and they're here for maybe half an hour, and I just found, I realized, it's like I had my heart just kind of opening up, blossoming. Why? Because, frankly, there was masculine friendship. Now, I live with my Legionary brothers, but the reality is I don't have a lot of contact outside of the handful of people I live with. I don't, frankly, have a lot of like friendship level contact with other guys. I tend, for whatever, to be more surrounded by women these days. So it's beautiful admirers. I have my RC men, but they're never around. So, I mean, what do you do? And I remember when they left, I was just realizing that filled me up. Okay, what was it? It was companionship. Okay? There is a level of communion that takes place. Why? Because we're friends, we kind of have a common language and everything, and you can, rib each other and do all the things that guys do. And you like being around them. There is a level and a form of companionship there. And that's actually, by the way, very important for all of us. Why in Regnum Christi do we have teams? Why do we get together every week or every couple of weeks or whatever and have, in your case, a group of ladies that you share things with regularly? That becomes a band of, well, not a band of brothers, band of sisters. It becomes not just a support, it becomes people who are on Regnum Christi teams and who are generous and do it for a period of time. It becomes a group of women that they love to be with, and they look forward to their weekly encounter or their every other week encounter or whatever, and they draw wisdom from the other women in the group, and there's companionship and sisterhood and friendship, and like I said, emotionally the tank is filling up. There's a lot that comes from that. And that's speaking to, again, that the fact that we are made for communion. The second level, or second stage, if you want, physical intimacy. Again, this goes beyond just simply, sexual contact. But the fact that you and I are made as bodies and souls means that all of us, every aspect of us, is called to communion. We are called to love with our bodies and with our souls. For example, you've probably already heard this, but I think it was back in the 50s, they did some psychological study with newborn babies. Fortunately, they're not allowed to do these kind of studies anymore, but they had, handful of newborn babies over here and a handful over here. With these ones, they treated them the way you would normally treat a newborn baby. They would, nurse them, and give them a bottle, love them, come in, give them attention, play with them, change. The other ones they dealt with clinically. All of their material needs were taken care of. Fine. They were cleaned. Could have been cleaned by a robot, but they were cleaned. They were fed, whatever. The babies in Group B died because they were not receiving emotional and, if you want, physical stimulus. That was not a sexual thing. That was just simply, we are made to express love physically. when you come here, I watch you all, stand around, hug each other, and do all the things that you do, and even me sometimes. So Father, especially with Latinas, and they can't avoid the Italians and Latinos. Forget it. I'm not getting away without a hug. It's like not going to happen. There's an importance to touch. Yeah, we joke about it as legionaries, as the priest, but we have our dog Rico. Rico is a dog. But in a certain sense, he also fulfills, I can't roughhouse with the fathers. I don't know, am I particularly inclined to. Legionaries, when we're in the seminary years, we play a lot of sports that also, in a certain sense, kind of satisfies that same thing. But Rico is something he's not a someone, he's a something, he's a dog. You can pick him up, you can play with him, slap him around, and he gets all happy and rub his belly, and he does all the Rico things, and there's something there, okay? The third one, psychological intimacy. By the way, I used the word intimacy. I probably should have just called it communion, so as to not confuse the terms. In my mind, they are very closely related, but not the same thing. I think intimacy is kind of the gateway that leads to communion. But anyway, I wrote it down as I wrote it down. And let's refer to this as simply the desire to be understood or known. Okay? There was a video. Actually, it's on formed.org. Do any of you people watch the Formed videos? Sam Scavone, when he does the search in the parish, it's one of those formed.org videos. So in New Jersey, we do we call it Wine and Wisdom, but we were using the Beloved series, which is about marriage prep. But it's very deep. It is very well done videos on marriage, Christian perspective, and very good Catholic speakers. Not too many priests, it's almost all lay people who happen to be well studied and are talking about their own experiences and whatever. So there is a famous chastity speaker. Her name is Leah Darrow. And she has an interesting story because she was actually one of America's Next Top models. And then in the middle of that, one day she was just like, what the heck am I doing? She kind of had this God moment and she just backed out. And she became a chastity speaker. And she married eventually her husband. And I'm looking at the two of them, and she's too old to be a model now, but she's still a pretty girl. She's probably in her 40s, I'm guessing. And he just looks like Joe Normal. I'm sure he's a great guy. But in these series of videos, they're talking, and she said, she looked straight into the camera, and she says, right before, when they were already engaged, and shortly before they were going to be married, they were out in a park or something. One time she just kind of grabs him and just looks him straight in the eye and just says, I want you to tell me right now, what is it that you are looking for? And he had a great answer. Just said, to be known. Just looked eye to eye and just said, to be known. Somebody who will know me on the inside. Okay? Now, there are different levels to that as well, as you can imagine. But this is something that maybe not on the level that Leah Darrow and her soon-to-be husband were talking about, but this is where somebody like a good mentor, perhaps one of those loving, caring coaches, like, you see those movies about the football coach who cares and changes your people's lives. A good teacher, the teacher who cares, gets to know you. A spiritual director, a confessor. Okay? So you can go. It is a very deep need that is being met. But still, the knowledge remains at a certain level because, for example, as much as a spiritual director and a confessor, you may share things with me, maybe even share things with me that your spouse doesn't know, and in a certain context that can be okay. You can speak to me, you can reveal, and I can know you kind of more from an intellectual perspective. But that's not yet to the point where we are sharing, if you want, emotions. You would not want your priest to become somebody who enters into the intimacy of your heart and your emotions. That is reserved for your husband and for God. Because, there's a hierarchy there. Okay, and that I think is the difference, at least in my mind, between what I refer to as psychological intimacy and spiritual intimacy. Psychological intimacy, we can say you're letting somebody in, and there's authentic care and concern, and generally it's based upon something that we have mutually committed to or common cause. For example, as your spiritual director, you care about God, I care about God, we have a common goal, a common cause. I want to help you to get to know and love God. And yes, I care about you certainly as an individual, and I can care about you greatly. But it's in light of, if you want, kind of this common goal or common cause or common unifying factor. In a marriage, it's no longer that. It's really about, I love you absolutely. And I want to give myself to you absolutely. And I also expect you to reciprocate absolutely. I don't want anything to be held back. And the more that we can open ourselves and be absolutely vulnerable and share the depths of what's going on in there, physically, spiritually, emotionally, everything, the tighter that bond is going to be, the more beautiful the marriage is going to be. I think what happens, I mean, there's been many talks about this, but what happens when marriages fail? Generally speaking, husband and or wife is wrapped up in their work, and then this person is wrapped up in their life, either work or staying at home or whatever their particular mission is, and we love each other and we know each other and everything, but you're kind of living two separate lives where we, there's a certain bond, we get together and everything, but eventually, if we're not sharing intimately, we're not taking time to know each other. It's almost like we're living with friends with benefits almost. I hate to banalize it that way, but it becomes that, kind of a 2.0 version of that if we're not careful. And marriage is meant to be the two become one, interiorly. That is the communion that satisfies. And when we're in a marriage and we don't experience that, that's when we realize there's something missing here. And that's when the temptation to start looking for other things. Other things could be in the form of other people, or it could just be in the form of, other plans, careers, other goals, circle, whatever. Things that are an attempt to fill the void. Clearly there's some deer behind me. How am I doing for time? Not bad. Okay. Now, if you are, spiritual intimacy, I've already pretty much touched upon this. So spiritual intimacy means to be known and accepted, not only, I would say, in the intellectual level, but emotionally, as we've said. And at the deepest core, the deepest level then of this spiritual communion and intimacy you and I are called to is the intimacy with our Creator. Now think about this. Even with your husband, you do not reach this level. Christ, in the Blessed Sacrament, chooses to become physical, incarnate if you wish, in the form of the host, so that as often as we wish, frankly, we can receive him into our hearts, and the two can become one in a way that's deeper, really, than any other union humanly possible. It is a true presage of heaven. The Holy Spirit who chooses to live in your heart as in a temple, in the most intimate spot, in a way, who understands you and knows you and loves you more than you understand and know and love yourself, who certainly understands and knows and loves you more than you understand, know, and love your spouse, or are understood, known, and loved by your spouse, and who, frankly speaking, is the glue that will enable you and your spouse to truly and permanently know and love and be united with one another. Now, those of you who are educated listeners, I'm going to have to wrap up in a minute here. Did I say until 25 or till 20? Oh no, still got a few minutes. Those of you who are educated listeners will probably notice something. How many of you have ever heard of or read the book by C.S. Lewis called The Four Loves? Aha, I knew it. I knew you were going to. So, The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. Classic, beautiful book. I really highly recommend reading it, as frankly with pretty much anything Lewis writes. When I was preparing this talk, I got about halfway through the second point and I realized, wait a minute, this sounds strikingly familiar. Now, I did approach things somewhat different from him. He's looking at, first of all, he's looking at the loves of the heart. He's not looking at communion. So I'm approaching things from a slightly different perspective. But C.S. Lewis, taking from the ancient Greeks, said there are, in the old Greek language, 4 different words for love. In English, we've reduced it to 1. There was the word storge. Storge basically is the love of affection. Your fond memories when you come home and there's that smell that your mom's house had that brings back good memories. The nostalgia of playing with Rico on the floor. Also human warmth and warm feelings. And pretty much it's kind of that nostalgic or the love of affection for certain things. It could be towards a person or towards places or memories or experiences. It is good, it is valid, it is beautiful. It is not theological charity, but it is a building block. The second one he refers to is philia, the love of friendship, which corresponds pretty closely to when I was talking about psychological intimacy. When you have somebody, well, I also mentioned companionship, that would actually even be closer. The love of companionship is the love of friendship, which also may dip into that psychological intimacy where a good friend who knows you, who you share things with, can also fulfill that need. Eros, from which the word erotic comes, is the love of romance. Again, it is a word that gets reduced. Pope Benedict wrote his encyclical on loving. It was, I suddenly lost the name with the distractions in the background. Anyway, it was Caritatis in Deus Caritas Est. Thank you. There it is. Deus Caritas Est. God is love, name of the encyclical. And he talks about the different forms of love. Eros, properly speaking, means that I see in you something that is good for me. A reductive vision of that would be I use you as an object, which is where things like pornography and things come from. That is a reduced version of true proper erotic love. But true proper erotic love in the good sense would be that your beauty, your nobility, the things that are in you that make you beautiful and wonderful and attractive as a person are something that I feed off of and I appreciate and value. And in a true romantic relationship, you want your spouse. You don't want to be looked at like a piece of meat to be used. But of course you want your spouse or somebody significant to you to think that you are likable, to want to be around you, to think that you are beautiful, all those things. There's nothing wrong with that. It tends to express itself in human relationships as the love of romance. And again, properly speaking, C.S. Lewis refers to, he says it can reach a very high level. Romantic love can elevate you. It's the first level of love, you can say, that can make you step out of yourself, forget about yourself for a while, make yourself want to heroically give yourself to the other, even if I have to die in order for the one that I love, and all these. Why are there so many romantic novels and movies and poems and plays and everything about the lover who wants to give his life, or doesn't want to, but is willing to? Think back to, for example, the movie on the Titanic. Remember? There were girls that would go and watch that movie like 15 or 20 times. They knew the plot. It's not like I forgot how it went again. What happened? There's something about a chunk of ice. No. They knew the plot. But they wanted to experience over and over again the love of somebody who was willing to give their life in that way. It was a high degree of romance. He was willing to, you could even say agape, self-emptying gift of self in that case. And then that leads to the highest level, which is agape, which is divine love, in which you and I can share and participate through theological charity, which is a gift from God. Faith, hope, and charity are gifts that need to be given to us by God. Are there human versions? Yes, but those are not the theological virtues. The theological virtues, properly speaking, is taking that which you and I are capable of because we're spiritual beings and supercharging it with God's grace. And in the case of love, agape is the love of the cross. When you are willing to sacrifice yourself, give yourself, empty yourself radically and totally simply for the love of the other person and their sake, that is theological charity. That's the kind of love Jesus showed in the crucifix. Jesus gained for himself nothing. It was all for us. And he paid everything. He paid far more than you and I will ever be able to even understand that he could pay. And that is something that, like I say, in and of ourselves, you and I are not capable of that. It is something that only God can give. So, just to summarize then, you and I have been made by God for communion. The gateway to communion is intimacy, and there are different levels of communion, if you wish: companionship, physical intimacy, for physical companionship, if you wish, psychological and spiritual. They are not separate silos, although they do tend to build upon one another. And this is the path towards our happiness. This is what you and I are made for. When we live proper relationships of communion, then the things like the sin of lust, which ultimately is using people, either in our imagination or in direct real-life contact with another or whatever, those things stop becoming options for us. And when we focus on living true communion, then the result in terms of our relationship with our own bodies is going to be chastity. Just quick parentheses, again, because chastity gets a bad rap. Chastity does not mean, by the way, only consecrated chastity where you don't exercise in a certain sense your sexuality that way. Chastity is just simply the catechism definition of it is simply to it is the integration of your human sexuality and your person. That's all it is. In your case, you are all women. What is in a certain sense, how do I use my body, and what is my physicality and my sexuality in all the different aspects? Like I said, coming in when you have small children, those mom hugs and those mom things that you do is one dimension. The romantic dimension, all the different ways that a woman loves in a feminine way. That is what chastity is going to look like for you. And it depends really on each circumstance what the manifestation will be. When we focus on communion, then the result in terms of our physicality and our sexuality will be the virtue of chastity. So with that, we will wrap up.